God wants to be your father. And he wants to give you a new identity as his child. I have great parents. Had great parents growing up. They were super involved in my life. They came to every activity, extracurricular and church-wise. They were heavily involved in my lives, my dad as well. I remember in my sophomore year of cross-country, I took up cross-country running my sophomore year. I'd worked really hard all season, and my parents were coming to every meet, which is a lot to ask if you've been to a cross-country race. They're not all that exhilarating or exciting unless your child is contending to win it, or if you yourself are in it, it's kind of like watching paint dry, and I love the sport. But my parents faithfully came all the time. This was my last race. It was in the Morris County Championship race over in Hanover, I think we were racing. And my parents were there. I towed the line, the gun went off, and off I went. And I was passing people all during the race, feeling really good. I had been improving that season, and I was at the top of my game this race. Now, this was the JV race. It wasn't the varsity, and it wasn't the freshman race. It was kind of everybody else's race, and that was me. But I was running, doing really well, passing guys. And as we came over the last hill to go into the home stretch, I passed a few more people, and I crossed the line, and they handed me a medal, my first medal. I still have it. The Morris County Championships JV race for 14th place. I was so proud, top 20 medals. Thank you. Top 20 medals, and I got mine, and it was the first one. I was so proud of myself. I left the finish chute, and my parents came over, and my dad specifically came up to me, and he said, "Andrew, when I saw you crest that final hill in 14th place, he said, I got all choked up, and I swelled with pride. I'm so proud of you." The real medal, why this one's important to me, wasn't the 14th place in JV. It was my dad said, "Andrew, I'm proud of you." Now, it's not like I knew he wasn't proud of me. My parents have been proud of me no matter what. If I never ran, if I won the race, I knew their support and their affirmation. But there was something about that moment when he said, "Andrew, I got choked up seeing you crest that hill and come down and finish in 14th. The real prize for me was the pride of my father, the love, the affirmation of my father. See, dads have a significant power to give their kids the best gifts, right? They can give you really the formation of your identity. But we also know the tension of fathers who take so much from their kids. Fathers who abandon the family, fathers who were unfaithful, and maybe that's been your story too. I know for many of you, you think back to memories where you currently experience wonderful things with your father. And you know his love, his affirmation, his support. He's there for you, you know it. And like me, you've got a great story to tell, many stories to tell. Others of you, though, I know you're sitting here and seeing skits about fathers and hearing songs and lyrics about fathers, and now this guy up here is talking about fathers, and you're already on edge. And you feel the tension and the disappointment because your dad wasn't that for you. Your dad took from you. He took so much from you. Or what he did put in you was an identity that was shattered and broken and hurt and painful. I know that's some of your stories. Some of you wish you had more memories of dad, but he just wasn't even there. One thing I do know, though, is that good or bad, present or absent, we all had a father in our life, right? We couldn't be here unless there was a father somewhere in the story. And the thing is, our fathers impact our view of our heavenly Father significantly, right? The U.S. National Fatherhood Initiative has found that 1 in 4 children grow up in homes without a father. And they say this has led to a father absence crisis in America. The U.S. Department of Justice has found that people within their system, this is the Department of Justice, the corrections and all that, they found that 63% of suicides reported to them came from children without a father, and that 90% of runaways and homelessness conditions, 85% of behavioral disorders, 71% of high school dropouts, 70% of juvenile detention inmates, 75% of substance abuse patients, and 75% of rape incidences occur in people who didn't have a father in their home. Kara Powell of the Fuller Youth Institute says that despite what kids and teenagers say, the number one influence in a child's life is a parent, and specifically dad. There's a father absence crisis in our country, and I believe that that is true in the spiritual realm as well. There's a father absence crisis because we haven't related to God as our Father. Jesus talked about that, and he wasn't the only one. People who followed him talked about how God could be your father. And one guy, an unlikely guy to talk about God being the father, was this man named Saul. Saul grew up in a devout Jewish home, worshiped God. He was the Jew of all Jews. He became a Pharisee, which was a really strict sect of Judaism. They felt like it was their responsibility to guard Judaism from paganism and from compromises. So he grew up in that, and he became a Jesus hater. These people had started worshiping this Nazarene named Jesus, and they were calling him the Son of God. And Saul and his group would have nothing to do with it, so the temple enlisted Saul to become the hitman and track down these Christians and snuff them out. So he's going from town to town persecuting Christians. On one of his trips, Jesus, the one he had been persecuting, the followers of whom he had been persecuting, appeared to him, knocked him down, and gave him a new identity. And Saul went from a Jesus hater that day to a Jesus worshiper, and his whole life was changed because he met the resurrected Jesus. So now his mission was to go around all of the non-Jewish area and talk to the non-Jewish, the Gentiles, about this Jesus that he used to hate, but now he loves, who gave him a new identity. In fact, Jesus even changed his name to Paul, from Saul to Paul. When Saul started to relate to God as his Father through Christ, everything changed for him. He had a new identity. So one of the cities he wanted to go to, of course, in the Roman Empire was Rome, the seat of power. But he hadn't been there yet, so he wrote a letter to send ahead of him, ahead of his trip there, to start to touch on some things he needed to talk about. Now, he had heard that there were difficulties between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people in the church, so he wrote a letter saying, hey guys, we can be on the same team in this one family, God's family. The problem is, we've all sinned. That's his technical term for living outside of God's ways, for living in opposition to God, in fact. He said, we've all got that same problem. We all have a sinful nature, a sin problem at our core, and it's common to the Jewish people, to the non-Jewish people. We're all together, but we can all be rescued from that sin condition. And this is where he concludes and kind of climaxes that argument. We'll check it out in Romans 8. Here's what Paul says in Romans 8. So then, brothers, we're debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. I love how he says brothers. He's not saying, hey, you guys, you've messed yourselves up. Let me set you straight. He says, look, I'm in it with you. In fact, this is a family problem. This is a family dysfunction that we can address together. How do we do it? Well, if you live according to the flesh, you will, or actually you're about to die. Flesh is Paul's way of saying that sin problem, that way of opposing God, of living in contradiction to his ways, that's so deep in you and in who you are, it's like it's part of your biology. It's your flesh. That's his way of saying, and this was a common word. Other people use the word flesh. This isn't a unique term to Paul. But he kind of gives it this new meaning of your problem, your brokenness is so bound up in you, you can't get rid of it. It's like it's in your skin and bones. It's that deep. Now that's kind of offensive, right? If Paul sauntered up to you and said, hey, you've got sin, it's basically part of your DNA. Now, I don't think Paul believed that in the human genome there was some gene labeled sin, but he said it's so intricately woven into who you are that it's basically formed your identity. Boy, if he told me that, I'd be a little offended, would you? If some guy came up to you and said, hey, look, here's your problem. You've got a problem that you can't fix. It's so part of you, it's defined you. What? Come on, Paul, that's not very nice. But if you think about it, it's true. I mean, how have you done with living according to your own standards? How often have you satisfied the good intentions you had perfectly all the time? I mean, we mess our own plans up, let alone God's ways. So yeah, Paul, okay, I can admit this problem is deep in me. It's as if it's part of my DNA. Well, that's kind of a hopeless message. So he continues. He says, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. All right, well, hold on, Paul. So first, I'm so broken that brokenness is bound up in me, and it's like it's part of my flesh and blood. Now you're saying that the dying me can put to death the death in me? How does that work? He says, well, it's not up to you. It's up to the Spirit of God who does that. He can go in and he can undermine that sinful nature. It's almost like the poison of sin that's poisoning you. He can poison it with his love and his righteousness and his purity. And he can go deeper than that sin DNA, and he can give you a new identity. Whoa. Well, that's pretty amazing, and that's what he talks about now. He says, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. Now, Paul, in those last 4 verses, just kind of went through this family tree kind of thing, right? He's using a lot of language that was common to households in the first century, and some of which are common to us today. Fathers, children, sons. I don't think anyone is involved in slavery. I hope not. So that's kind of a foreign concept to us. We've got some American history and knowledge about that. But still, those terms that he's using are loaded with first century meaning and context. And so I wanted to go through and look at what it was like to be a father, a child, a slave, so that we can go back in time about 1,970 years or so to when Paul wrote this, around 50 AD, and we can feel the message like his audience felt the message. These weren't just empty words. These were loaded with meaning, with rich meaning. So if you'll come back with me in time to around 50 AD and become a part of a Roman household in Rome, Jewish or Gentile, we're part of a Roman household. Here's what it looked like to be a father. Fathers, and by the way, this culture was patriarchal, which means it was male-oriented, male-dominated. That's not just a Bible thing. That was an everybody thing. That was like a universal thing. That's the way most of cultures in human history have operated. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That just was. And so you have to realize that was some of the stuff that you'll figure out and learn. It's a product of being a male-oriented society. Anyway, so fathers. Fathers were called the pater familias. They were the head of the household. I guess I should say the pater familias. Right? This was Italy, after all. So fathers were known as the pater familias, the head of the household. And they had patria potestas, the power of the father. It's like super dad, right? They had this power, total authority. They had total deciding authority over everyone in their household. That didn't just include their children. It included their grandchildren, if they lived long enough, their great-grandchildren, their wives, their slaves, anybody in their household. They had total unrequited authority. Nobody could correct them if they thought they were wrong. If dad said it, if the pater familias said it, that was what was going on. Now they could exercise that authority in any way they wanted. And they had that authority until death, which gives a whole new meaning to when we hear Paul say in another letter, Ephesians 6, he says, children, obey your parents. You might be 30 years old obeying dad still in that kind of household. Dads had, the pater familias had authority until he died. Until then, his sons couldn't own property, couldn't decide things for themselves. He had total say-so, the pater familias. He was also responsible, of course, for the security and the well-being of the household, as we might imagine. So that's what a father looked like. Now, as children in the Roman world, their lives, their mere existence was determined by the pater familias. When a wife had a baby, she would take that baby to the pater familias. The father would lay it at his feet, and if he picked it up, he would embrace that child into his family. But if he turned and walked away, that indicated that that child was not wanted. And they would take it and put it on a hillside somewhere outside of the settlement and leave it. It was called exposure. And this frequently occurred, especially to girls. The men wanted sons to carry on the legacy and the lineage of their family. So girls were often unwanted, and left out to die by the elements, by animals, by whatever means. And many of them, of course, did. Countless of them did. Some were taken up by others to become slaves in their own household or slaves to sell in the slave market. Again, most of these were girls, and so often that included prostitution. That's what it meant to be a child. Children were very low on the social totem pole in the Roman world. They were considered inferior. They hadn't quite developed cognitive, deliberative thinking yet. That was the presumption. They were ignorable. Of course, they were the hope of the next generation, so there was some hope to that, but really only if they were boys. That's who had the hope of the family. Girls were, by and large, ignored, gotten rid of, just kind of in the way. That's what it meant to be a child. They didn't exist, really, until their father named them also. I talked about how kids were left out, and girls often, especially, and they were forced into slavery. Slavery is something that's foreign to our culture, but it was the norm in the first century Roman world. 40% of Rome were slaves. In fact, there were so many slaves in Rome that the Senate, the Roman Senate, said, you know what, maybe we should make them wear some certain type of clothing so we can identify them. Because, by the way, slaves didn't just work in farms or mines, many did, but they also worked for senators. They worked in municipal government. They worked as county clerks and things like that. They had high positions. Some were architects, some were engineers. Basically, any job that a Roman person didn't want to do, they would make a slave do. And that was a lot of jobs. So everybody had slaves. 40%, like I said, of Rome was slaves. So the Senate said, hey, maybe we should distinguish these slaves because they look like all of us. We don't want to be mixed up. But then they said, no, if we made them wear some special clothing, they would see how many slaves there were, and there could be an uprising, and they could take over the whole Roman Empire because there were so many. It was the norm. Slavery was the norm. Most of these slaves came from children who were exposed. They were unwanted children. Many slaves were products of the debt culture. If you owed someone money, you might just become their slave. Some were prisoners of war and so on. Slaves came from all over the world in the Roman Empire. They flooded in. There was a huge market for slaves. They were thought to have no capacity for deliberative thinking. Meant they had no common sense. They had no thought that was original to them. They were subhuman. They were just property. And the paterfamilias and the sons in his household could do and did do anything they wanted to slaves. And remember, many slaves were women or girls and children. They had total rights without repercussions. There were no laws protecting slaves. If the head of the household wanted to treat them a certain way, they did. And if you know anything about the first century Roman world, it was grotesquely promiscuous and terribly deficient in its ethics of sexuality and things like that. And so horrible things went on to slaves, and they couldn't do a thing about it. They were just the property to be used as the owner enjoyed. And interestingly, slaves were thought to have no father except their slave master. They had no father. It was like they were orphans. So, with your head in that kind of household, can we read again what Paul wrote into that context and see if we can feel what it was like to hear these words that he's saying? Romans 8:14, he says, "For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God." Sons. He's talking to men and women, Jews, non-Jews, young, old, slave, free. He's saying, in this family, you can be a son, the preferred child. Whether you're a woman or a man, you can be esteemed by God as a son. But notice the order that Paul puts this in. He doesn't say if you're a son of God, then you're led by the Spirit of God. He says, no, the key identifier that you're a son of God is that you are led by the Spirit. Those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. In other words, to show that you're embracing this identity of being a son of God, you submit to the Spirit's leadership. You say, I bow my knee to you, Father. You're the paterfamilias in my life. You have total authority. Your will is right, is good, is binding on my life. I submit myself under that, in that relationship. And that's how I'm a son of you, of the paterfamilias. And he goes on and says, you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you've received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Pater. Now remember what it was like to be a slave. He says, you don't have to go back to the fear that sin brought in your life. When sin was your master, when it could do anything it wanted to you. And many of these people hearing this, by the way, are slaves. They knew the experience. Maybe they were slaves. They certainly know slaves. They know masters who were terribly cruel to slaves. And they're hearing Paul say that you once were a slave to sin. He talks about it in some previous chapters. But now you can have a new head of household who treats you as a son, as a chosen son, adopted. You don't have to go back to that lifestyle of fear where it was crippling, where you were totally abused and ravaged by sin. You don't have to go back to that master. Go to the Father who's calling you home. You didn't receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but we can call him Abba, Pater. Now, Paul uses the Aramaic. That's what the Jewish people spoke. We think they spoke Hebrew, and they spoke Aramaic. That was the lingua franca of Jews. And Abba is Aramaic for daddy, father. So to the Jews, they hear God is our Abba, our daddy. And then to the Gentiles, to the Romans that are hearing this, that spoke Greek, Pater was the equivalent, the Greek equivalent. Pater, daddy. So I love what he's doing. He's saying, all of you, from whatever background you are, if you're a Jewish person, if you're a non-Jewish person, you can call on one Father. In your own language, in that heart language, you can call to your daddy, who calls you son. And by doing that, he's uniting this church under one Father as co-equal sons chosen by God to relate to him in this unique relationship as father to children. It's amazing what he's doing. He's redefining family and church and relationship with God. Now, it's interesting. The Romans didn't call their gods Father. You just didn't do that. The Roman pantheon, they had many gods, right? Zeus, Hermes, we know them from history class probably. The stories about those gods were pretty terrible. What the gods did in the heavenlies, how they would, their promiscuity, the way that they'd have children with other gods and steal and manipulate and connive. And that's how people believe they interacted with people too. So you didn't relate to the Roman gods as Father. You appeased them, you gave offerings, you tried your own little manipulations, you tried to swindle things out of the god's grip. That's how you related to God. You didn't call the gods Father. Paul says you can, though, the one true God. He wants to be your Father. He wants to give you a new identity as his son. And he does it by adoption. Now, Jewish people had no legal understanding of adoption at that time. It wasn't something that they did. So when Paul is talking about things like slavery and being children of God, the Jewish people in his audience in that early church in Rome, they would have thought back to the things that they talked about every Passover. That story of their people way back before where they were led out of Egypt as slaves. And actually, the first thing Moses told Pharaoh as a message from God to get his people out of Egypt was this: Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go so that he can worship me. So the Jewish people in Paul's audience, they're hearing, oh yeah, we used to be slaves in Egypt. We couldn't make our own decisions. We were captives. And so now we're adopted as sons. But the Roman people, the non-Jews in Paul's audience, they wouldn't have known this history of Israel. And so Paul uses this term, this legal term of adoption to get them in the game too. And this is what adoption looked like. Adoption was a legal process initiated by the paterfamilias. Paul uses that word 5 times in his writings, 3 times in the book of Romans. Adoption could take place at any age. It didn't have to be young children. In fact, the second emperor of Rome, Emperor Tiberius, was himself adopted. Caesar Augustus didn't have a son, and so he adopted this distant relative named Tiberius, and Tiberius inherited all the rights of being a son of the emperor, and he himself became emperor when Augustus died. So it was a legal process, no age, there was no age limits, and these sons would be brought into the new family under the paterfamilias in this 2-step process. So first, the original dad would meet up with the soon-to-be adoptive father, and he would pretend to sell his son 3 times to the new father. The first 2 times, he would symbolically, using these scales and copper bits and pieces like money, symbolically, he would buy his son back from the adoptive father 2 times. The 3rd time, he wouldn't buy him back, thus symbolizing that he'd given all the rights of his son to this new adoptive father. And that father would take the son to a local magistrate before witnesses and would declare him fully inheritor of this father's estate, the full son with all the rights and privileges. And he became a legal son. He wasn't subpar. He wasn't second class. In fact, remember how much power the paterfamilias had to decide what children he wanted. When the paterfamilias went and adopted a son, that showed significant favor and significant election to be part of his family. So if you were an adopted son, you enjoyed almost a special class of relationship with this paterfamilias. And that's what Paul is saying God does. He looks out and he says, I want you in my family. Now remember, a slave had no father in the eyes of the Roman law. And so by default, if a slave were to win or earn his freedom, their master was now regarded as their father. Paul said, you used to be slaves to sin. If you're set free from slavery to sin, your normal understanding is that sin now becomes your father, not just your master. But Paul says, no, there's one who comes in and says, no. Sin, you can't have that child. I'm buying him back. I'm buying her back to be in my family, to belong to me with all the rights and privileges that my firstborn son would enjoy. And that's what your Father in heaven does for you. He steals you back. He buys you back over the life of his own son, with the life of his own son, to belong to him and be in his family. That's who your Father is. But what if we doubt this? What if we doubt the impact of that, the significance, the truth of it, the divine legal truth of it all? Paul says there's a witness who stands and testifies that you are indeed a son of God. And that's what he says in verse 16. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we're children of God. Now remember that adoption process I described, the buying back 3 times? That was done before 7 witnesses. So that if the original father decided, it changed his mind and said, no, that guy took my son. He stole my son. 7 witnesses would come to the local magistrate and say, no, we watched that adopting father buy this son. He owns him outright. There's no more ties to the old father, to the old master. The Spirit of God himself stands by your side and says, you are mine. No one's taking you back. And the result is that we're children. More than that, we're heirs of God and fellow or joint heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him. Paul keeps using these words, with. Everything that is Christ's, everything that is Jesus, who is God's son, Scripture says. Not son like we have babies, but in a divine, equal way, he's God's son. Everything that is his is now yours when you stand with him. God has given you all of the favor, all of the merits, all of the beauty of Jesus when he calls you son. And you're heirs. It's your right. It becomes your identity. God ought to make us slaves. He ought to make us work off our debt. We disobeyed him. We denied him. We lived life apart from him so many times. We still do, right? God should make us work off our debt for the rest of our days. We should become his slaves. Instead, he says, be my sons. Isn't that amazing? Think of the debt you owe God, and he forgives it and says, don't relate to me like a slave master. Relate to me like a son, because that's what you are. Earlier in Romans, Paul talked about how we're slaves to sin, but now we're slaves to righteousness. he's building his case to go from this idea that you're slaves to sin, and now you owe God your life. But he says it's not just like a debt that you're paying back, kind of an owing. It's a worshiping. It's a saying, yes, God, you can become my pater familias. You can become the head of my life. I submit to you. And I do it because I realize your love for me, your goodness, your choice of me. You have a new identity when you become a son of God. I don't know how you've related to God in your life. I don't know how your relationship with your earthly father or absence of one impacts your view of God and how this kind of a talk feels in your soul. But I know this is true, that God looks out in this room and he says, do you want to be my child? Do you want to be my son? Male or female, right? Remember the status that son had in the family. Do you want that kind of privilege and right and love and relationship with me? Do you want me to be your father? Do you want to become my child? He's still asking that. So I'd ask if you would close your eyes. Close your eyes. And picture God standing here with Jesus, his firstborn son, at his side. He's the head of this household. He has total authority. His say goes. And he looks out in this room, and he looks at you. And he says, do you want to be my child? Will you have me as your father? He gives you that invitation. He gives you that decision. Do you want that relationship with your Father in heaven? If that's a decision that you finally understand and you're finally ready to make, you're finally ready to let go of your grip on life, you finally realize the slavery that you've been in under the weight of sin that was so bound up in who you were, you couldn't get rid of it even if you tried. And you did try. You tried countless times and it never worked. It never stuck. You're finally ready to say, I'm done with that master. I want a new father. Would you pray with me if you're ready to make that decision? Jesus, we need you. We love you. We come to God, our Father, not as ones who deserve anything. We deserve all your wrath, but instead you give us your favor and love, your choice to make us sons. So Lord, I pray that you'd stir in hearts now, and those that are ready to make that decision to become a son of God, to call you Father. Lord, apply the power of your Spirit in their heart now. If that's you with your eyes closed, I'd ask you to raise your hand. If you're ready to say, yeah, I want to become a child of God. You can just pray with me silently in your heart. Lord, I admit that I'm broken, that I have disobeyed you in so many ways. But now I'm done serving that slave master of sin. I call you Father. I call you Father because I understand that Jesus took my place and paid for my punishment. He killed the death that was killing me. And I stand now in his new life that he rose again into. My hope is in the resurrected Jesus to give me the life of Jesus so that I can worship you as Father. I love you, God, and I need you. Change my heart. Amen.